Out in the deserts of the American Southwest, archaeologists still find traces of movements that should not have been possible for small migrating groups. Obsidian blades carried hundreds of miles from their source fire pits clustered in patterns that no one fully understands, and ancient camps tucked so cleverly into mountain folds that even modern trackers struggle to find them. These early signs feel like the quiet footprints of a people on the edge of becoming something formidable, as if the land itself was shaping minds and muscles long before names like Chiricahua Mescalero or Jicarilla existed. Beneath the dust, each clue whispers that, long before the world knew the word Apache, there was already a restless, brilliant migration underway. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. The earliest story begins far north in the subarctic forests of what is now Western Canada and Alaska, where linguists trace the Athabascan language family, one of the most sprawling linguistic networks on the continent. Sometime between 1000 and 1500 CE, small groups of southern Athabascan speakers drifted southward, following river valleys, hunting routes, and seasonal pathways that pulled them toward warmer climates. Their journey stretched over centuries, a slow migration rather than a dramatic exodus shaped by necessity, curiosity, and the quiet logic of survival. Over generations, they crossed vast plains, skirted the Rocky Mountains, and threaded their way into the American Southwest, a region that would become both their proving ground and their sanctuary. By the time these migrant families reached the deserts and forested uplands of the Southwest, they had already transformed into something distinct. The climate was harsher, the animals different, and the seasons unpredictable. Yet instead of bending under the strain, they adapted with a kind of quiet determination. Archaeological sites in the Mogollon Rim region and along the Rio Grande show evidence of early Athabascan groups experimenting with new forms of shelter, mixing hunting strategies and learning the terrain, as if absorbing the habits of the land itself. They traveled lightly, carried few possessions, and built their world around mobility rather than permanence. This early period also hints at cultural blending. The newcomers interacted with long-settled Pueblo peoples, observing agricultural rhythms, learning local geography, and sometimes forming fragile alliances. Even though they never adopted full sedentary agriculture, evidence suggests exchanges of pottery styles, food preparation methods, and possibly ritual concepts. These interactions provided the incoming Athabascan groups with both opportunity and challenge, access to trade, but also competition for resources. Their mobility became both shield and signature, a way to avoid entanglement while surviving on their own terms. As generations passed, these families organized into the earliest versions of what would later be recognized as Apache groups. Their leadership style began forming around small, flexible family bands, each moving with the seasons through mountain valleys, desert plains, and high plateaus. The natural world became their teacher. The unfamiliar desert became their training ground. While archaeological evidence cannot offer a complete picture, it suggests shifting campsites, carefully placed lookout points, and hearth remains that reveal patterns of movement rather than anchored villages. Everything about their early presence communicates adaptability, caution, and a growing confidence in the harsh new homeland. The Southwest itself shaped their cultural worldview. The land was both harsh and beautiful, filled with cliffs that offered shelter and danger forests that hid both prey and predators, and valleys where storms could roll in with sudden ferocity. Their stories, preserved later through oral traditions, remember mountains as living beings, desert winds as warnings, and night skies as maps for travel. These ideas likely took root during this early period when survival depended on reading the landscape with perfect clarity. Even the practical aspects of daily life bore traces of this evolving identity. They crafted tools from available stone, wove baskets suited for portable living, and used hunting strategies that favored stealth over force. The rhythms of life were organized around sunrise travel, evening fires, and seasonal routes that looped across territories stretching hundreds of miles. Archaeological remains show a consistency of light, mobile living pit houses, used only temporarily, fire pits reused but never settled permanently, and refuse scattered sparsely, the signature of people who never stayed long enough to leave heavy footprints. Through all this, a quiet mystery lingers in how these early migrants managed to maintain cultural coherence across such vast distances. Linguistic similarities across Apache dialects point to shared ancestral roots, yet regional differences show centuries of adaptation. The balance between unity and divergence suggests a flexible cultural fabric, one that allowed them to remain connected while adapting independently to the varied landscapes of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico. As time moved toward the late first millennium and early second millennium, the Athabascan migrants fully rooted themselves in the Southwest. What had begun as a slow migration now crystallized into distinct identities. The ancestors of the Chiricahua settled in rugged mountain ranges. The ancestors of the Western Apache remained near forested uplands, and groups that would become the Mescalero roamed along the plains and mountain boundaries. This growing diversity was not fragmentation, but refinement. Each group learning the nuances of its terrain and shaping its culture to fit. By around 1400 to 1500 CE, these communities had established an identity grounded in mobility independence and an intimate relationship with their environment. They were not yet the fully recognized Apache nations of later centuries, but the foundations had been set. The skills, values, and worldview that would define them in history's most turbulent moments were already forming in this early era, shaped by a land that tested every step and rewarded only those who could adapt. The Apache identity took root not through conquest, but through endurance. In a landscape that punished the unprepared, their emerging culture became inseparable from the desert itself. The sun dictated movement, the mountains dictated defense, and the scarcity of water dictated cooperation within each band. They were learning through generations of trial and error to make survival into an art. By the time the 15th century dawned, their relationship with the Southwest had become symbiotic, a living rhythm between people and terrain that no outsider could easily understand. The deserts of Arizona, the mountains of New Mexico, the plains of West Texas, and the arid basins of northern Mexico each offered a different set of lessons. The highlands demanded stamina and knowledge of edible plants. The lower valleys required mastery of ambush and concealment. In the dry seasons, they moved from canyon shade to canyon shade, following game or ripening cacti. In the brief rainy seasons, they gathered wild seeds and roasted agave hearts, a food so vital it later lent its name to entire Apache bands like the Mescalero Mescal people. Their intimate understanding of desert ecology was no accident. It was the result of hundreds of years of lived observation, carried in stories, songs, and rituals, rather than written words. Over time, these scattered family groups coalesced into recognizable divisions: Western Apache in the Mogollon Rim Country, Chiricahua in the southern mountains, Mescalero on the plains edge, Chicarilla to the north, Lipan to the east, and the Nedni stretching into northern Mexico. Each band spoke dialects of the same language, yet the environment sculpted subtle differences in tone, vocabulary, and rhythm. Linguists studying their speech centuries later would still hear the imprint of geography in their words, the sharp clipped phrases of mountain people, the more open drawn syllables of plains travelers. Their belief system also reflected this deep environmental imprint. Life in a world where storms could erase a camp overnight fostered humility. The Apache spiritual worldview held that power flowed through the land itself, not through temples or idols. Sacredness was local, found in mountain springs, in the shimmer of heat over stone, in the whisper of desert wind. They prayed not for dominance, but for balance. A young hunter might seek a vision from a mountain spirit before his first journey. Women whose role in daily life was as vital as men's learned rituals to ensure food gathering succeeded or childbirth passed safely. The result was a culture where spirituality was woven through every act, practical and mystical at once. They did not build stone monuments like the Pueblos or mound cities like the Mississippians. Instead, their architecture was transient brush shelters called wicayups, or lean-tos of wood and grass, easy to assemble and easier to abandon. This mobility was not a sign of poverty, but a deliberate adaptation. It allowed them to avoid drought-flea enemies and follow opportunity. The Apache way of living was to never be trapped by the landscape, yet to remain completely in harmony with it. Within this system, leadership emerged not through hereditary right, but through proven ability. A man gained influence by his skill in hunting or his wisdom in counsel. Decisions were made collectively, with elders guiding by persuasion rather than command. This decentralized approach made the Apache both resilient and frustratingly elusive to those who would later try to conquer them. Every band could dissolve or reform according to need, without any single leader to capture or any central authority to destroy. The rhythms of everyday life moved with the seasons. Families traveled together, women carrying infants and baskets, men scouting ahead, older children learning to identify tracks and landmarks. Food gathering was a collective affair, harvesting mesquite beans, gathering nuts and berries, roasting agave, drying meat for lean months. The Apache cultivated patience. The desert demanded it. Nights were spent around small shielded fires, where elders recited stories of origin, cautionary tales, and lessons wrapped in metaphor. To a stranger, these stories might sound like simple myths, but they encoded survival knowledge: where to find water after lightning storms, how to read the stars for direction, when to move before floods came. Their sense of humor and quiet sarcasm also became cultural tools for resilience. Laughter softened fear. Jokes about hunger or hardship turned misfortune into endurance. This understated humor would remain a hallmark of Apache identity, even through centuries of tragedy ahead. Over generations, these habits evolved into social codes. Sharing food was sacred. Hoarding brought shame. Hospitality to travelers was expected. Betrayal was unforgivable. Marriages linked families across distant territories, creating invisible alliances that stretched farther than outsiders ever realized. Children were raised communally, absorbing lessons through observation. Punishment came rarely, and gently disapproval carried more weight than violence. Their entire social fabric rested on balance, personal independence, held in harmony with responsibility to kin. It was also during these centuries that Apache warfare began to take shape, not as conquest, but as defense. Raiding was born from necessity to acquire horses' goods or revenge for losses. But unlike the large-scale battles of other societies, Apache warfare was surgical and psychological. A successful warrior was not one who killed the most enemies, but one who struck, vanished, and returned his people unharmed. This emphasis on stealth patience and precision turned into a tradition of guerrilla skill that would baffle European armies centuries later. Archaeological evidence suggests a growing sophistication in weaponry, carefully balanced spears, bows, designed for short-distance accuracy, and later trade-acquired metal blades. Yet, even as their tools changed, the mindset stayed rooted in adaptability. An Apache fighter could use terrain as weapon, an outcropping of rocks as fortress, a narrow canyon as trap, a thunderstorm as cover for escape. This intuitive mastery of geography was the true source of their power. While the world around them shifted, Pueblo civilizations flourishing, ancestral Hopi building mesa villages, and far to the south, Aztec empires rising, the Apache remained in motion, carving out an existence just beyond the borders of larger civilizations. They were not isolated, but selective in their engagements. They learned from others, traded when it suited them, and withdrew when it did not. Independence became a kind of quiet creed. By the 15th century's close, the desert had shaped the Apache into something paradoxical, deeply rooted, yet endlessly mobile, harsh, yet deeply spiritual, fiercely independent, yet bound by communal ties. The stage was set for centuries of collision with empires, missionaries, soldiers, and settlers. But at this point in their history, they were still free people of the desert, unseen and ungoverned masters of their own vast sunburned world. By the time the 16th century began to stir, the Apache world was a mosaic of moving families bound together by shared memory and language. Each band knew its mountains and valleys like the lines of a palm. Trails cut through stone and sand were not random wanderings. They were seasonal arteries drawn from centuries of migration hunting and quiet diplomacy. Within these landscapes, daily life revolved around balance between independence and kinship war, and peace, hunger, and abundance. This balance became the true heart of Apache society. The structure of Apache life defied the hierarchies familiar to European chroniclers. There were no monarchs, no bureaucratic councils, no permanent seats of power. Leadership arose organically, tied to reputation and respect. A capable warrior, who proved both courageous and wise, might become a Nantana headman, but his authority extended only as far as others willingly followed him. The moment he lost credibility, his power vanished like footprints in shifting sand. This system fostered resilience. No single death could cripple an entire people. It also reflected their worldview that strength belonged to the group, not to one individual. Each band, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, or Western Apache was a small self-sufficient network of extended families. Decisions were made through quiet discussion, often in evening circles around the fire. Elders held influence, but so did women whose insight into alliances, trade, and daily sustenance carried equal weight. The Apache did not divide the sacred and practical. Both were part of survival. Women gathered, cured hides, managed camps, and raised children, while also participating in spiritual life, conducting healing ceremonies, and preserving oral histories that transmitted law, geography, and ethics in one breath. Their oral tradition was so comprehensive that outsiders would later struggle to comprehend how a people with no written records could recall centuries of detail. Memory was their archive song, was their scripture. Through stories, they taught not just origins, but tactics, how to read animal signs, how to move unseen through canyons, how to track an enemy by the faintest trace. Some stories were so old that their heroes lived half in legend and half in geography, their footsteps tied to particular ridges or riverbeds. Marriage formed another pillar of daily life. It bound not only individuals, but entire clans, weaving networks of obligation and trust that stretched across hundreds of miles. Young couples often lived with the bride's family, emphasizing matrilineal ties. Gift exchange and ritual feasting sealed these unions. Divorce, when it came, was neither scandalous nor violent. It was acknowledged, and life moved on. Apache society valued emotional steadiness and dignity in hardship, qualities shaped by generations of survival in a land that never forgave rashness. Children were taught early the value of silence and observation. Loud boasting or impatience was discouraged. A boy might spend hours learning to follow a deer trail without a sound. A girl might practice weaving or cooking while listening to elders' stories. Lessons were given in calm tones with humor and metaphor. A child who failed was teased, not beaten. Discipline came through gentle ridicule, a method that trained both humility and resilience. Ritual life maintained harmony between the people and the natural world. The most sacred ceremony was the sunrise dance performed when a girl reached puberty. For 4 days, she embodied the spirit of white-painted woman, the life-giving mother of all Apache. The dance celebrated renewal, endurance, and womanhood as the source of future generations. In that ceremony, the entire community reaffirmed its bond with creation. Later warriors would carry those same values into battle, the understanding that strength was cyclical, drawn from balance, not domination. Foodways reflected the same philosophy. The Apache did not waste, nor did they overhunt. Deer, rabbit, and turkey provided meat, mescal yucca cactus fruit, and wild onions supplemented the diet. In some regions, they traded for maize or beans from Pueblo neighbors, but they preferred self-reliance. The process of roasting mescal in earth pits for days infused the camp with an aroma that signaled community. Even their cuisine spoke of patience, the slow rhythm of the desert encoded in each meal. Though they lacked large-scale agriculture, the Apache were not technologically primitive. They crafted finely balanced bows of osage or juniper, wove durable baskets coated with pitch to hold water, and developed ingenious ways to preserve food in hot climates. Their clothing, deerskin buckskin or woven yucca fiber, was functional and symbolic. Designs often represented clan identities or natural elements. Later, when European trade goods arrived, they incorporated beads and cloth, into existing traditions, reshaping foreign materials into Apache expression. The seasons dictated their movement. In summer, they sought the cool shade of higher elevations. In winter, they descended to valleys where game remained. Campsites were chosen for access to water and visibility for defense. Fires were small, carefully shielded, producing little smoke. A trained eye could erase all signs of habitation within minutes, a skill that baffled later soldiers, who found no trace of camps that had existed the night before. To the Apache, invisibility was not secrecy, but safety, a principle as sacred as prayer. This same discipline extended to warfare, which at this stage remained defensive and ritualized. Conflicts usually arose over resources or revenge. Raids were swift, targeted, and guided by strict codes: courage without cruelty, success without arrogance. Captured enemies were rare. Unnecessary killing was frowned upon. Warfare was as much spiritual testing as strategy, a way to prove balance under pressure. A young warrior who returned from his first raid underwent purification rites, symbolically washing away death's shadow. These values shaped a culture of endurance that would later astonish outsiders. When the first Spanish explorers entered the region, they encountered people who seemed to appear and vanish at will, their settlements nowhere to be found, their trails erased by wind. The Apache already viewed the land as both protector and battlefield. Their concept of home was not a place, but a network of memories, paths, and sacred sites spread across the desert's expanse. There were mysteries even within this stability. How did they maintain unity without centralized authority? How did knowledge spread across such vast distances? Anthropologists still debate these questions, suggesting that gatherings for trade ceremonies or marriages acted as information exchanges. In this decentralized yet interconnected world, the Apache maintained cohesion through culture, not control. As the 16th century advanced, the world beyond their deserts began to shift. To the south, Spanish armies conquered empires and searched for golden cities. Rumors of armored men and thundering beasts on four legs trickled northward through trade routes. The Apache heard of these strangers long before they saw them. They prepared, quietly strengthening alliances, studying the trails that led toward Mexico, sensing that the rhythm of their world was about to change. The first glint of foreign armor arrived like a mirage. Word spread through distant trading partners long before any Apache eyes saw the riders themselves, men who shone like the sun, speaking in strange tongues, riding animals taller than deer and faster than elk. To the nomadic families of the Southwest, such stories sounded half mythic, yet every whisper carried unease. These were not traders or wandering pilgrims. They were conquerors. The first Spanish expeditions moving north from Mexico in the early 1500s came searching for wealth, souls, and glory. What they found instead was a landscape ruled by silence, distance, and people who did not kneel easily. The Apache had spent generations mastering this land, while the newcomers stumbled under its heat and scarcity. At first, the two worlds only brushed edges. Spanish explorers passed through territories lightly inhabited, focusing on pueblo settlements whose masonry and agriculture looked more familiar to them. But contact was inevitable. The Spanish frontier crept northward, carrying missionaries, soldiers, and diseases. It brought horses to animals that would soon revolutionize the balance of power. Before the horse, Apache travel was already formidable. With it, they became unstoppable. By the early 17th century, scattered groups of Apache had acquired horses through raids, trade, or capture. What began as novelty soon turned into identity. Horses extended their range, accelerated communication, and transformed warfare. Mounted warriors could strike distant targets and vanish before pursuit began. The Apache adapted faster than any other desert people. The arid land that slowed armies became their ally. Within a generation, the horse was sacred companion and weapon alike. This transformation reshaped their economy. Raiding became more systematic. Part survival, part resistance, part assertion of autonomy. The Spanish saw theft. The Apache saw redistribution in a world that had suddenly tilted. They raided missions and settlements for livestock tools or captives, sometimes trading these spoils back to frontier merchants. What outsiders interpreted as chaos was actually a fluid economy of exchange and retaliation, guided by unwritten rules. Raiding was not wanton destruction. It was strategy, a message that no border could cage them. The Spanish, locked in their own imperial mindset, failed to grasp this. They built presidios, fortified outposts from Sonora to New Mexico, and sent detachments to pacify the land. Yet the harder they pressed, the more elusive the Apache became. Ambush replaced confrontation. An entire garrison might vanish into the silence of the desert, the only trace, a few spent cartridges and hoofprints leading nowhere. It was as if the land itself rejected occupation. At the same time, cultural exchange persisted in unexpected ways. Some Apache bands traded with frontier settlers, exchanging hides and horses for metal tools, beads, or food. Missionaries, in turn, recorded fragments of Apache belief and language, though always filtered through European misunderstanding. To the missionaries, they were heathens. To the Apache, the priests were merely another kind of traveler, bringing gifts with one hand and chains with the other. Conversion rarely took root. The Apache spirit world could not be replaced by foreign saints. The mountains and winds were too familiar, too sacred to abandon. The Spanish introduced something else beyond weapons and horses, new diseases that tore through indigenous populations. While some Apache bands escaped the worst waves by virtue of mobility, others suffered catastrophic losses. Epidemics undermined entire alliances and reshaped migration routes. In the aftermath, survivors adapted again, consolidating into smaller, more agile bands. The flexibility of their social system, once merely practical, became their greatest defense. By the 1700s, Spanish authorities began to categorize the Apache into subgroups, trying to understand their enemies. They named them, according to geography, Chiricahua, Chicarilla, Lipan, Mescalero, Western Apache. These distinctions were partly accurate, partly imposed from outside. In truth, Apache identity was fluid. People shifted affiliations through marriage, adoption, or necessity. The Spanish need for fixed categories only proved how little they understood the people they fought. Meanwhile, the introduction of firearms changed everything. Muskets reached the frontier through trade and theft, but their slow reload and heavy weight limited their value. The Apache preferred bows, lances, and stealth tools suited to fast raids and rough terrain. When firearms improved in later centuries, they would adapt again. But for now, their traditional weapons remained extensions of their bodies. Every bowstring, every arrow carried the knowledge of ancestors who had lived and died by precision. The Spanish frontier was a line of exhaustion. Soldiers stationed in distant presidios lived in fear of sudden raids. Villages fortified themselves with adobe walls, and merchants traveled under armed escort. Yet despite the violence, there existed a strange interdependence. Settlers depended on Apache trade for horses and animal hides. Apache bands relied on settlements for certain goods they could not produce. The borderland became a living contradiction hostility wrapped around necessity. Some Apache leaders experimented with diplomacy. They visited presidios to make peace or to negotiate prisoner exchanges. Treaties were spoken, celebrated, and broken with equal ease. For the Apache agreements lasted only as long as they were honored. For the Spanish, they were instruments of expansion. Neither side truly trusted the other. The frontier, more than a line on a map, became a long negotiation in dust and blood. In the midst of these tensions, the Apache identity hardened. Their rituals incorporated the horse. Songs began to celebrate mounted raids. Children grew up knowing that vigilance was survival, that every dawn required readiness. This era forged the image that later outsiders would romanticize the mounted warrior with flowing hair, the master of ambush and endurance. Yet beneath that image lay centuries of adaptation, community, and grief, none of which fit neatly into legends. The land itself recorded these stories better than any chronicler. Caves held smoke stains from old camps. Mountain passes bore faint etchings of clan symbols, and along riverbeds lay fragments of pottery traded from faraway tribes. These traces, scattered across Arizona, New Mexico, and Chihuahua, form the invisible map of Apache memory, a geography of endurance that spanned borders long before such borders existed. When the Spanish Empire began to crumble in the early 19th century, a new order rose from its ruins, but for the Apache, it was merely another shift in the endless rhythm of outsiders claiming their land. In 1821, Mexico declared its independence, inheriting not only the territory of the northern frontier, but also centuries of unresolved conflict. The presidios remained the missionaries still sought converts, but the empire's wealth and discipline were gone. What filled the vacuum was uncertainty, an open, volatile landscape in which the Apache saw both danger and opportunity. The Apache had never accepted the idea of national borders. For them, the land was continuous mountains flowing into plains, canyons, blending into desert. Now suddenly, those familiar trails and waterholes were cut by imaginary lines separating Mexico from the United States. To the Apache, those boundaries meant nothing. They still traveled from Sonora to New Mexico, from Chihuahua to Texas, following the seasons and their own networks of kin. But the world around them no longer understood such freedom. The new governments viewed the Apache not as neighbors, but as obstacles. In Mexico, independence brought economic instability and fractured authority. Soldiers deserted settlements, dwindled, and isolated ranchers became easy targets for raids. To survive, the Apache expanded their raiding economy, stealing horses, cattle, and goods to trade or sustain their bands. To Mexican officials, these attacks appeared as rebellion. To the Apache, they were simply the continuation of a cycle established long before. Raiding had always been part of the balanced revenge for broken promises, recovery of stolen property, or assertion of strength. Yet these raids intensified as colonial order collapsed. Mexican militias retaliated with increasing brutality, launching punitive campaigns deep into Apache country. Soldiers burned camps, destroyed food stores, and captured women and children. In response, the Apache adapted again. They divided into smaller, faster-moving groups, slipping through mountain passes before dawn and disappearing into wilderness before any pursuit could begin. Entire military expeditions wandered for weeks without finding a single trace of them. The desert became their fortress once more. Trade routes that once carried goods between missions and towns now doubled as hunting grounds for Apache raiders. Caravans moved under heavy guard, and isolated settlements lived in constant fear of sudden attacks. But the Apache also relied on trade, often exchanging captured livestock for weapons and tools in black markets across the frontier. It was a paradoxical existence, war and commerce, entwined so tightly that one could not end without the other. In some areas, a fragile diplomacy developed. Certain Mexican officials, recognizing the futility of endless warfare, offered peace treaties and rations. Some Apache leaders agreed temporarily, seeing advantage in food and supplies without surrendering independence. But the peace never lasted. Corruption and betrayal from both sides shattered each fragile truce. When promised goods failed to arrive or soldiers violated treaty terms, the Apache struck back. In this unstable borderland, trust was a currency no one could afford. Meanwhile, across the northern horizon, another power was rising: the United States, expanding westward after the Louisiana Purchase, and driven by the ideology of manifest destiny. In 1846, the U.S.-Mexican War erupted, and when it ended 2 years later, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred vast swaths of territory, including much of Apache land, to the United States. For the Apache, nothing changed physically, yet everything changed politically. The soldiers chasing them now wore different uniforms and spoke a new language. The flags above the forts were different, but the frontier still demanded tribute in blood. At first, the Apache observed these new arrivals with wary curiosity. American explorers, surveyors, and traders passed through their territories, bringing rifles, new trade goods, and rumors of endless migration from the east. The Apache noted how quickly these strangers multiplied, building towns where only sagebrush had stood. To some leaders, the Americans seemed less predictable than the Spanish or Mexicans, more technologically advanced, but equally dismissive of native sovereignty. The introduction of repeating firearms during this period began to tilt the balance of power. The Apache, who had long relied on bows and captured muskets, adapted once again, trading or capturing advanced weapons when possible. The horse, however, remained their greatest strength. Apache warriors could ride 80 miles in a single night, descending from mountains to strike at settlements and retreat before dawn. Their raids reached deep into Sonora and Chihuahua, sometimes even into Texas, leaving colonial officials powerless to defend such vast frontiers. Despite the violence, Apache bands maintained complex internal worlds. Ceremonies continued, children were born, songs were sung. In mountain refuges, elders still told origin stories under starlit skies. Every raid, every hardship reinforced communal bonds. Their endurance became their culture's defining virtue. Outsiders saw only hostility. They missed the quiet devotion behind it, the belief that to survive with honor, one must never surrender to fear. By the mid-19th century, the Apache had achieved a paradoxical reputation. To settlers and soldiers, they were fierce marauders. To some frontier traders, they were valuable partners. And among neighboring tribes, They were respected, even feared for their discipline and adaptability. Each band had its own leaders and territories. The Chiricahua roamed the Dragoon and Chiricahua Mountains. The Mescalero moved through the Sacramento Mountains. The Lipan and Jicarilla patrolled the plains. Though divided by geography, they shared language kinship and a code of conduct rooted in balance. The constant warfare began to shape identity more deeply than ever before. Songs of horses and raids joined ancient rituals of healing and harvest. Warriors decorated their weapons with symbols representing protection and stealth. Young men sought visions before raids, fasting and praying in the hills. Women, too, carried the spiritual burden, preparing food, tending to the wounded, and ensuring rituals of cleansing were observed after bloodshed. In this way, the Apache kept their humanity intact amid endless conflict. When Mexico, desperate to end the raids, offered bounties for Apache scalps, the brutality reached new depths. Mercenaries and militias hunted indiscriminately, killing women and children for reward. The Apache responded with even greater mobility, retreating into remote mountain strongholds and launching surprise retaliations. The violence turned cyclical, with no end in sight. Yet the Apache survived, as they always had, by dissolving into the land that had raised them. The arrival of the United States Army in the Southwest began not with thunder, but with the slow grind of bureaucracy. Surveyors marked the desert with boundaries that meant nothing to the land itself. Soldiers erected forts at lonely river crossings, and wagon trains carved deep ruts across what had once been Apache hunting trails. By the 1850s, the frontier was alive with tension. For the Apache, it was the beginning of a new phase of survival, one that would demand both diplomacy and defiance in equal measure. At first, encounters were cautious. American officers sought to understand these desert warriors who appeared and vanished like spirits. Some tried treaties, offering food and peace in exchange for confinement to defined territories. The Apache listened, nodded, and vanished once more into the canyons. They understood that words written on paper meant little in a world governed by storms and hunger. The Americans, impatient and unused to the fluid logic of desert politics, mistook caution for deceit. Misunderstanding hardened into mistrust, and mistrust turned swiftly into war. The landscape of conflict changed dramatically. The United States, newly armed with repeating rifles, and the telegraph, believed it could impose order on the desert. Yet technology could not erase terrain. Apache warriors, trained from childhood to read every ridge and shadow, continued to outmaneuver entire regiments. The army called them phantoms of the mountains. The Apache simply called it survival. They moved camps nightly, left force trails, and used weather itself as cover. A thunderstorm could scatter soldiers, but to an Apache tracker, it was an invitation. As new forts appeared, Fort Bowie, Fort Apache, Fort Stanton, the war became a chessboard across the Southwest. Bands under leaders like Mangas Coloradas and Cochise began to distinguish themselves for both discipline and mercy. They avoided unnecessary killing, but struck with precision when provoked. Soldiers soon learned that even a single insult or broken promise could reignite the fires of vengeance. Among the Apache memory was sacred and betrayal never forgotten. Life within the bands continued even under siege. Women gathered mesquite beans and wild onions, roasted agave hearts in hidden pits, and prepared dried meat for long journeys. Children were taught to move silently, to notice the smallest details, the way birds fell silent before danger, the faint shimmer of heat revealing distant movement. The Apache camp was a school of endurance, its curriculum written by necessity. Elders told stories at night, recounting how ancestors had survived the coming of the Spaniards and the Mexicans. Now they added a new name to the list, the Americans. By the 1860s, the United States itself was divided by civil war. As armies in the East tore each other apart, the frontier became a neglected theater of chaos. Settlers fled or armed themselves, soldiers were recalled, and the Apache seized the moment to reclaim old hunting grounds. But the war also brought new weapons and hardened veterans westward once peace returned. When the Union triumphed, the U.S. government turned its full attention back to expansion and to the Apache who stood in its path. In these years, Apache warfare evolved further. Scouts became the soul of each band trackers who could smell rain hours before it fell, who could interpret footprints as sentences. Ambush replaced battle, and patience replaced numbers. A single well-planned strike against a wagon train or fort could paralyze entire regions. The Army's response was brutal scorched earth campaigns, destruction of food supplies, and relentless pursuit. But the Apache were masters of retreat. When surrounded, they dissolved into the rocks. When cornered, they scattered and regrouped miles away. For soldiers raised in organized formations, such fluidity felt supernatural. At the same time, diplomacy remained a weapon of its own. Some Apache leaders experimented with peace as strategy, signing treaties to gain rest, then resuming raids when those promises were inevitably broken. They knew how to read the fatigue in their enemies' eyes. A treaty to them was not surrender but camouflage. Each lull in fighting allowed families to recover, horses to heal, and supplies to be rebuilt. The Americans, unable to comprehend such pragmatism, accused them of treachery. But in Apache, logic trust had to be earned daily, not assumed by signature. One of the most remarkable aspects of this period was the Apache ability to integrate knowledge from every enemy. From the Spanish, they had learned horsemanship. From the Mexicans, the use of firearms. From the Americans, the psychology of frontier warfare. They adapted each new lesson without ever abandoning their own identity. Even as their numbers dwindled, their spirit sharpened. In this crucible of conflict, leadership would soon crystallize around figures whose names would echo through American memory: Mangas Coloradas, Victorio Nietzsche, and Geronimo. But before those legends took the stage, the Apache endured decades of relentless attrition. U.S. forces captured key water sources, cutting off mobility. Missionaries built schools that sought to erase Apache culture. Diseases, smallpox, measles, tuberculosis returned again and again, weakening the bands from within. Yet even as their population declined, their defiance grew stronger. Every captured warrior inspired another to fight. Every burned camp became a symbol of endurance. To understand why the Apache resisted so fiercely, one must grasp what the desert meant to them. It was not merely home, it was kin. The mountains held the spirits of ancestors, the wind carried their voices. To surrender the land was to betray one's own blood. The Americans could not comprehend this worldview. To them, land was property to be fenced and owned. To the Apache, it was life itself, shared, cyclical, and indivisible. The clash then was not only military but philosophical. Each skirmish was a collision between two incompatible visions of existence. For the Americans, victory meant control. For the Apache, survival meant freedom. Neither side could yield without ceasing to be itself. And so the wars dragged on season after season with no clear end in sight. By the late 1860s, stories of Apache raids filled newspapers across the frontier, fueling public outrage and justifying harsher military campaigns. Yet beneath the sensational headlines, something deeper stirred a grudging respect. Soldiers who fought them often admitted admiration for their courage and cunning. Captured officers wrote of Apache generosity to prisoners, their discipline in hunger, their refusal to waste even a bullet. The very qualities that made them feared also made them noble in the eyes of those who survived. Cochise was already a seasoned warrior by the time most Americans had heard his name. Born around 1805 among the Chokanane band of the Chiricahua Apache, he grew up in the rugged heart of what is now southeastern Arizona, a land of granite ridges, hidden springs, and narrow valleys, ideal for ambush and retreat. The Dragoon Mountains were his cradle, his fortress, and his teacher. He learned every pass and waterhole, every trick of light that could reveal a distant rider. By the time he reached adulthood, he had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. To his people, Cochise embodied balance, brave in war, wise in counsel, and fiercely loyal to his kin. For years, he maintained a tenuous peace with the growing number of white settlers and soldiers pushing westward. He traded livestock and knowledge of terrain for goods like cloth, metal, and tobacco. But peace on the frontier was as fragile as the desert's morning mist. In 1861, a single incident, small at first glance, ignited one of the bloodiest conflicts in Apache history. It began near Apache Pass, where an American officer named George Bascom accused Cochise of kidnapping a rancher's child. The accusation was false. The boy had been taken by another group entirely. But Bascom demanded surrender, seized Cochise's family, and refused to listen. The event became known as the Bascom Affair, and it shattered a generation of uneasy coexistence. Cochise escaped captivity by slashing open his tent and fleeing under gunfire, but his brother and relatives were executed by the soldiers. In retaliation, Cochise struck back with precision and fury, killing hostages and attacking wagon trains across the region. The desert erupted. Every insult and betrayal of decades past seemed to echo in this single moment. The war between the Chiricahua and the United States had begun. For the next decade, Cochise led a campaign that combined tactical brilliance with profound restraint. He never attacked without purpose, and he never fought without reason. His strategy was simple yet devastating. Strike hard, vanish faster, and choose the battlefield where the enemy was weakest. Soldiers chasing him through the narrow canyons of Arizona often found themselves ambushed from above, arrows and bullets descending like invisible rain. The terrain itself became his ally. To those who knew only open field warfare, the Apache style was incomprehensible. They fought not to conquer, but to exhaust. Cochise's partnership with the older leader, Mangas Coloradas, strengthened Apache unity. Mangas, whose domain extended into New Mexico, shared both blood ties and vision with Cochise. Together, they coordinated raids, exchanged intelligence, and maintained communication across vast distances. When Mangas was treacherously captured under a flag of truce in 1863 and murdered by soldiers who displayed his mutilated body, Cochise swore that peace with the Americans would never again be trusted. The betrayal cemented his resolve, and his legend grew in the telling. Life for the Apache during this period was grueling but purposeful. Families moved constantly to avoid army patrols. Women roasted mescal in hidden pits by night, camouflaging the smoke. Warriors scouted from ridges at dawn, using mirrors or dust signals to communicate across miles. Even under pursuit, there was rhythm raiding, gathering, resting storytelling. Children born during these years grew up with the sound of distant gunfire as background noise to their lullabies. The desert had become both cradle and battlefield. The US military, frustrated and humiliated, responded with new tactics. They built Fort Bowie near Apache Pass to guard a key corridor and launched relentless campaigns to hunt Cochise down. Columns of cavalry swept through valleys, burning food stores and capturing non-combatants. Yet Cochise's intelligence network was unmatched. He knew troop movements before they happened, often through Apache scouts who worked within army camps as guides, listening and waiting. Every pursuit ended in confusion. Soldiers lost in country where water was scarcer than mercy. Despite the violence, Cochise sought peace on his own terms. He understood that endless war trained his people. In the early 1870s, through the mediation of a sympathetic army officer, General Oliver O. Howard, and the interpreter Tom Jeffords, one of the few white men he trusted, Cochise entered negotiations. Howard listened rather than dictated, and Jeffords spoke with respect rather than condescension. Against all precedent, Cochise agreed to a lasting peace if his people could remain within their ancestral lands in southeastern Arizona. The U.S. government, exhausted and eager for stability, accepted. The Chiricahua Reservation was established centered around their beloved Dragoon Mountains. For a brief moment, the desert knew quiet again. Cochise kept his word, ensuring his people stayed peaceful and defended their borders against provocations. He even befriended Jeffords, a relationship that symbolized rare mutual respect amid centuries of mistrust. When Cochise died in 1874, likely from illness, his people buried him in a secret location within the Dragoon Mountains, the site known only to a few elders. The wind and stone became his tomb. To this day, his grave remains undiscovered, hidden as he lived in harmony with the land. Cochise's death marked the end of an era of measured resistance and the beginning of one defined by desperation. Without his leadership, the fragile peace unraveled. Settlers encroached again, soldiers returned, and promises made by distant officials dissolved like mirages in the sun. The Chiricahua were ordered to new reservations far from the land they had just secured. To the Apache, it felt like betrayal resurrected. Yet the legacy of Cochise endured. His example of leadership, calm, principled, and fiercely protective, set the standard for every leader who followed. His ability to negotiate without surrender and to fight without cruelty left an imprint on both friend and foe. Even among his American adversaries, stories spread of his integrity and intelligence. Soldiers who once hunted him later admitted that they had never met a man so fearless and fair. When Cochise's voice fell silent in the Dragoon Mountains, the frontier exhaled too soon. Soldiers believed the Apache wars were finally over, but the quiet was only the pause before another storm. Across the vast deserts and mountain passes, a new generation of leaders was rising, men and women hardened by betrayal, fluent in both the old ways and the language of modern war. Among them stood Geronimo, born Goya Awe, meaning the one who yawns a name that belied the unyielding fire within him. He had fought alongside Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, witnessed massacres, and carried scars not only on his body, but deep in his soul. His story would transform the Apache struggle into one of legend and tragedy, resilience and myth. Geronimo was born around 1829 near the Gila River among the Bedonkohe band of the Chiricahua. From youth, he was marked by calm intelligence and quiet ferocity. He married young and had children, living a life of hunting, trading, and seasonal migration until 1851, when a Mexican militia attacked his camp near Llanos while the men were away trading. When he returned, he found his mother, wife, and 3 children murdered. The trauma defined him forever. He claimed that, in the aftermath, he wandered into the mountains where a spiritual voice spoke to him, promising that no bullet would ever kill him. From that moment, he believed himself under divine protection, and to many of his people, he seemed to be. After Cochise's death, the peace that had held under his leadership dissolved in a tangle of broken promises. The U.S. government began relocating the Chiricahua to the San Carlos Reservation, a stretch of barren land hundreds of miles from their homeland. Officials called it the Hell's 40 Acres of Arizona. It was a place of disease, scarcity, and humiliation. To be confined, there was to live without sky, without freedom, without dignity. Geronimo refused. With a small band of followers, he escaped, vanishing into the Sierra Madre Mountains of northern Mexico, a labyrinth of cliffs and canyons where only the Apache could survive. So began 2 decades of defiance. From 1876 onward, Geronimo's name became a whispered warning across the frontier. He led raids across the border, striking settlements, stealing horses, and liberating captives, then retreating into the mountains before pursuit could begin. The U.S. and Mexican armies, though rivals, found common cause in trying to destroy him. Columns of troops scoured the desert, aided by Apache scouts who had allied with the Americans in exchange for rations or safety. But Geronimo's intuition for terrain was uncanny. He used shadows as camouflage, rivers as pathways, and weather as a weapon. His movements were unpredictable, north into Arizona, south into Chihuahua, vanishing for months, reappearing hundreds of miles away. He was not a chief in the formal sense. The Apache had no kings, and Geronimo led by charisma and vision rather than decree. He inspired loyalty through daring generosity and an almost mystical confidence. To his followers, he was a link between the living and the spirit world, a man whose courage made death hesitate. To his enemies, he was a ghost that refused to die. The campaigns against him grew relentless. American generals like George Crook and later Nelson Miles dedicated years to his capture, deploying thousands of soldier scouts and native auxiliaries. Yet the desert always seemed to shield him. Soldiers who tracked him for weeks would find only empty fires, faint hoofprints, or the mocking trace of laughter in the wind. Even when surrounded, Geronimo escaped, sometimes by night, sometimes through sheer cunning. In one case, he eluded an entire regiment by marching his band up a river, erasing tracks under running water until dawn. Life on the run was harsh beyond imagination. Food was scarce. Constant movement left little time for rest. Families carried infants through torrential storms and over jagged rock. Still, Geronimo maintained discipline. He forbade unnecessary killing and demanded fairness even in warfare. When his people were exhausted, he sought peace, signing temporary truces, only to see them violated by settlers or soldiers who refused to honor the terms. Every betrayal deepened his mistrust and reignited the cycle of resistance. By 1885, the US government had lost patience. President Grover Cleveland authorized full-scale pursuit, and the army flooded the Southwest with manpower and technology. Telegraph lines crisscrossed the desert. Scouts tracked every rumor. Yet the Apache still slipped through. At one point, Geronimo's band numbered fewer than 40 people, including women and children. But they held entire divisions in disarray. Crook, exhausted, finally resigned, replaced by General Nelson Miles, a younger commander who used relentless pursuit, cutting off every source of supply and rest. In 1886, worn by constant flight and the suffering of his people, Geronimo agreed to meet under a flag of truce at Skeleton Canyon. He surrendered on September 4, 1886, marking the symbolic end of armed Apache resistance. But the surrender brought no peace. Instead of returning to San Carlos as promised, Geronimo and hundreds of Apache men, women, and children were shipped as prisoners of war, first to Florida, then to Alabama, and later to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The US government justified it as security. In truth, it was punishment for their defiance. Even in captivity, Geronimo's legend grew. He adapted once more, this time to survival within confinement. He learned English, posed for photographs, and sold autographs at fairs. To some, he became a curiosity, to others, a symbol of indomitable will. When he appeared at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, crowds lined up to see the Apache chief who had fought an empire. He was no chief, and he knew it, but he smiled anyway, using fame as another tool of endurance. Inside, he carried the same quiet fury, the same belief that his people's spirit could never be caged. In his final years, Geronimo converted to Christianity outwardly, though he continued traditional ceremonies in private. He died in 1909 at Fort Sill after falling from his horse and lying exposed to the cold all night, an ironic fate for a man who had defied death on battlefields for decades. In his last statement, he said simply, "I should have never surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive." It was not bitterness, but truth, a warrior's vow to the end. Geronimo's death marked the close of the frontier and the dawn of myth. His name would echo through generations, used by paratroopers as a cry of courage, invoked in movies and legends, often stripped of its pain, but never of its power. For the Apache, he remained what he always had been, a man of visions and contradictions, who fought not for conquest, but for freedom, in a world that refused to understand it. When Geronimo's band was shipped east under armed guard, the desert fell silent, as if mourning its fiercest children. The war was over in name, but its shadow stretched for generations. The Apache were now prisoners of a world that measured freedom in property lines and census records. Hundreds of men, women and children, warriors and elders alike, were scattered across distant forts, alien climates, and unfamiliar horizons. The government called it relocation. For the Apache, it was exile. They had not only lost their land, but their rhythm, the cycle of migration, hunting, and ceremony that had defined life for centuries. Their first destination, Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, was a stone fortress surrounded by humid air and ocean salt. The prisoners used to the dry breath of the desert suffered immediately. Disease spread through the ranks. Fever and homesickness claimed more lives than any battle had. The walls echoed with the murmurs of languages that no one outside the prison understood. Children who had once chased shadows across canyons now stared at the Atlantic, bewildered by its endless water. It was said that some elders would rise at dawn, face west, and whisper prayers to the mountains they could no longer see. Over time, the Apache were divided and relocated again. Some were sent to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, where the damp heat rotted their clothes and lungs alike. Others ended up at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a place of grasslands and storms, where the horizon felt both open and foreign. Here, the U.S. government sought to turn warriors into farmers, freedom into discipline. Officials measured success in plowed fields and attendance at church. But the Apache spirit, even in defeat, resisted absorption. To survive, they adapted in quieter ways. They built small communities within the reservations, preserving language and ceremony behind closed doors. Mothers taught their children to speak Apache softly so officials would not hear. Elders retold stories of Cochise and Geronimo, describing not only their battles, but their patience and restraint. Each retelling became a lesson in dignity. The younger generation, though born far from ancestral land, inherited its spirit through memory. The U.S. Army kept the Apache prisoners for an astonishing 27 years, the longest captivity ever imposed on any group of Native Americans. Even when most had long ceased resistance, they were still labeled dangerous. The irony was cruel. Those who had fought for their homeland were punished more harshly than those who had surrendered early. Yet within that injustice grew a strange kind of unity. The scattered bands Chiricahua, Mescalero, Lipan, Chicarilla found themselves living side by side, sharing stories and ceremonies that had once been divided by geography. Exile became a crucible of identity. Daily life at Fort Sill was structured by military routine. Rations were distributed at fixed hours. Schooling was mandatory for children, and soldiers patrolled the perimeters. Christian missionaries preached salvation, teaching that obedience would bring redemption. Some Apache converted outwardly, at least seeing in the new religion fragments of their own themes of endurance, sacrifice, and renewal. Others rejected it, choosing instead to honor their ancestors through songs whispered after sunset. In these small acts of defiance, culture survived where warfare could not, yet the cost was heavy. Many died in captivity of diseased despair, or the slow erosion of will that comes from endless displacement. The young adapted faster than the old, learning English and farming methods, sometimes serving as scouts for the same army that had imprisoned their kin. For elders who had known the freedom of the Sierra Madre, such compromise was unbearable. Still, they understood that survival meant flexibility, and they counseled patience. The mountain waits, they would say, meaning the spirit of their homeland, endured even when the body was far away. In 1894, after years of petitions and political debates, the government finally allowed some Apache families to settle permanently at Fort Sill. Others were transferred to the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico. The decision fractured communities, yet again splitting families who had endured decades together. Those sent to Mescalero found familiar landscapes, pine-covered ridges, cool air, and the scent of mescal roasting in pits once more. The land was not the old homeland, but it carried echoes of it. Slowly life began to mend. At Fort Sill, a few Apache men joined the army as scouts, turning their skills of stealth and tracking to new purpose. Their service earned a measure of respect and a small degree of freedom, though they remained under constant supervision. Ironically, their talents, once the terror of frontier forts, became assets to the very system that had tried to destroy them. History often bends toward paradox, and the Apache masters of adaptation understood this better than anyone. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had changed beyond recognition. Railroads stitched across the southwest telegraph wires hummed, and cities rose where camps once stood. Tourists visited Geronimo's grave at Fort Sill, turning tragedy into spectacle. But even as the world moved on, the Apache quietly rebuilt. They founded schools of their own, re-established councils, and revived ceremonies once banned by law. The sunrise dance, nearly lost in exile, returned as a declaration that womanhood and continuity would outlast captivity. The trauma lingered. Generations born in confinement carried an ache for mountains they had never seen. They dreamed of red cliffs, dry winds, and open horizons described by grandparents who spoke of them as paradise. Anthropologists later noted how even in Oklahoma, the Apache oriented themselves toward the west, when praying facing not a direction, but a memory. In 1913, the U.S. government officially ended the prisoner of war status of the Chiricahua Apache. Freedom came not with celebration, but with exhaustion. Some chose to remain at Fort Sill, having built homes and gardens. Others journeyed to Mescalero to reunite with kin. A few, weary of both, faded quietly into neighboring towns, changing their names to survive in a world that barely remembered their struggle. Freedom came not as a triumphant march, but as a hesitant step. When the Chiricahua Apache were finally released from prisoner status in 1913, there were barely 400 of them left. The survivors had endured nearly 3 decades of captivity, outlasting the politicians who had ordered it and the soldiers who had enforced it. They emerged into a world unrecognizable from the one they had fought for. Automobiles now rattled along the same plains where their horses had once galloped. Towns had risen on old trails, and the desert itself was crisscrossed by railroads and fences. The warriors who had defied 3 empires were suddenly expected to become citizens of one. Some Apache families chose to remain in Oklahoma, where they had built modest homes and schools during their captivity. Others longed for the mountains and cooler air of New Mexico and petitioned to settle on the Mescalero Reservation. The government, weary of resistance and paperwork, allowed both. The division created 2 main centers of Apache life: Fort Sill in Oklahoma and Mescalero in southern New Mexico. There, under the weight of memory, they began the slow, quiet work of rebuilding their nation. At Mescalero, the land spoke in familiar tones: pine forests, rocky ridges, the whisper of desert winds. It was not their ancestral Chiricahua range, but it offered spiritual shelter. Families rebuilt homes from logs, and adobe herded cattle and planted small fields. They revived ceremonies once outlawed: the sunrise dance for young women, the mountain spirit dance honoring the holy protectors of the 4 directions. These rituals, held secretly during years of exile, returned to open firelight. They were not mere performances, but acts of cultural survival. Each dance was a declaration the people still existed. Meanwhile, life at Fort Sill was different. The open plains of Oklahoma offered little comfort to those who had known the jagged horizons of Arizona and Chihuahua. Yet even here, the Apache adapted. They raised livestock, built schools, and formed councils to represent their community before the U.S. government. Many men found work as scouts or interpreters for the army, while others turned to farming. Despite poverty, they retained humor and resilience, their laughter echoing across the same parade grounds where soldiers had once drilled to hunt them. The early 20th century also brought assimilation pressures, cloaked in education. Federal Indian boarding schools sought to erase languages, traditions, and names. Apache children were taken from their families and sent to institutions hundreds of miles away where their hair was cut, their clothes replaced, and their tongues punished for speaking Apache. The policy was meant to kill the Indian and save the man, as one reformer put it. Yet even in these bleak schools, the old knowledge survived. Children whispered words of home under blankets at night, sketching mountains from memory, humming songs they pretended to forget. Culture hid itself like a spark under ashes waiting. The First World War arrived before many Apache had even been granted full citizenship. Yet when the United States called for volunteers, young Apache men enlisted in disproportionate numbers. Some saw it as a way to prove loyalty to a nation that had once imprisoned them. Others saw familiar honor in the act of defending one's people. Their service earned quiet respect, though little recognition. The irony was unmissable. The descendants of those once hunted as rebels now fought under the same flag that had pursued them. By the 1920s, the reservations at Mescalero and Fort Sill had begun to stabilize. Councils formed to manage resources, educate youth, and negotiate with federal authorities. The economy mixed traditional crafts, beadwork, basketry, leatherwork, with wage labor in nearby towns. Still, poverty remained endemic. Federal agents controlled much of daily life, from land allotments to school attendance. Yet within those constraints, the Apache preserved autonomy in subtle ways. Decision-making still happened through consensus, and elders' voices carried weight in council gatherings. During these decades, anthropologists and ethnographers arrived eager to record the vanishing Indian. They documented Apache myths, languages, and ceremonies with the assumption that the culture was dying. The irony again was thick by recording survival as extinction. They overlooked the quiet resilience that kept those traditions alive. The Apache cooperated, sometimes sharing knowledge to protect it, sometimes withholding the sacred. To them, the outsiders' notebooks were not threats, but tools. They would ensure that even if the world changed again, memory would endure. The Great Depression struck the reservations hard. Drought withered crops, and rations dwindled. Yet even in hardship, the community found rhythm. Elders organized communal hunts. Women wove and sold baskets to traders. Children learned both English and Apache, switching languages like a shield. It was a hard life, but it was their own. They had survived extermination, exile, and assimilation. Hardship, by comparison, felt almost familiar. The Second World War brought another wave of enlistment. Apache men served as scouts, code talkers, and soldiers in Europe and the Pacific. Though less celebrated than the Navajo code talkers, several Apache units used their language for secure communication, carrying on the warrior legacy in a new form. When they returned, they brought new skills, confidence, and a broader understanding of the modern world. They also returned to a homeland, still caught between past and future. The mid-century years saw the rise of policies encouraging termination of reservations and the relocation of native peoples to urban centers. For many, Apache, this was exile by another name. Families who moved to cities like Los Angeles, Phoenix, or Albuquerque faced discrimination and cultural isolation. Yet even there, community found a way, gathering in small apartments, cooking traditional food, and speaking the language over coffee instead of firelight. The Apache spirit, once sustained by mountains, now adapted to city streets. By the 1960s, change began again, but this time from within. A new generation, educated in both Apache tradition and modern law, began to demand recognition and sovereignty. They formed organizations, wrote petitions, and fought for land rights. Elders who had once hidden their language now taught it openly. Boarding schools began to close. Cultural programs reopened. The government that had once tried to erase the Apache was now compelled to negotiate with them. The balance, slow and fragile, began to shift. By the mid-20th century, the Apache had endured everything an empire could impose, and yet remained whole in spirit. The policies of termination and relocation, born in Washington conference rooms, were meant to dissolve tribal identity and absorb native people into the mainstream. But among the Apache, these programs only deepened the understanding that survival required not just endurance, but adaptation. What had once been an instinct of desert life, move when the ground turns hostile, became a philosophy for the modern world. Families who left for cities carried their culture folded inside them like a small fire kept under ash. In Los Angeles, Denver, and Albuquerque, they gathered on weekends to share food stories and news from the reservations. Children who attended public schools by day came home at night to hear old songs on scratchy records, their parents whispering translations between laughter. The Apache were learning to live in two languages, English for the world outside Apache, for the world within. Back home, the reservations themselves were changing. Federal control began to loosen as new leaders emerged from within. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 had offered tribes the ability to form governments of their own design. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Mescalero and Jicarilla Apache had functioning councils, police forces, and courts. Their constitutions combined traditional consensus with modern bureaucracy, an uneasy marriage, but one that worked. Elders still spoke first at meetings, their voices slow and measured, grounding each debate in memory. Economic survival demanded creativity. The Mescalero turned to forestry, managing pine and fir resources with scientific precision, while maintaining traditional respect for the land. The Jicarilla invested in cattle and later oil and gas leases, using revenues to fund schools and healthcare. At White Mountain and San Carlos in Arizona, tourism and crafts became lifelines. Visitors came for the landscapes, once feared, as Apache strongholds, never realizing they were walking through living memory. Every woven basket, every handmade drum was both livelihood and legacy. Cultural revival gained momentum during the 1960s and 1970s, part of a broader movement across Indian country. Young Apache activists traveled to Washington, D.C., joining the Red Power movement and demanding recognition of treaties long ignored. The American Indian movement's occupation of Alcatraz and later Wounded Knee resonated deeply. While the Apache had not fought on those front lines, they understood the message dignity was not a request, but a right. On the reservations, schools began teaching the Apache language again. Ceremonial grounds, once overgrown, were cleared for dances. The drums returned. With each revival came reflection. The stories of Cochise and Geronimo, once whispered as forbidden hero tales, now re-entered public memory through books, films, and oral histories. Elders reminded younger generations that legend should never replace truth. These men were not superhuman spirits, but fathers, uncles, and neighbors who carried impossible burdens. In that distinction lay the deeper lesson. The real strength of the Apache was never in individuals alone, but in community. By the 1980s, the economic foundation of many Apache tribes had begun to stabilize. The Mescalero developed ski resorts and hotels, turning the mountains into both sanctuary and enterprise. The White Mountain Apache created fish hatcheries and outdoor recreation programs that balanced preservation with income. Revenues from resource management funded scholarships, health programs, and cultural events. Where previous generations had fought to survive, this one was learning to thrive. Yet modern prosperity brought its own challenges. With television and urban culture seeping into reservation life, younger generations drifted towards the world outside. The Apache response was not to reject modernity, but to shape it. Youth programs began teaching traditional skills alongside modern trades, tracking with GPS language through computer games, history through film. The old ways were reimagined, not abandoned. Elders became teachers again. At night, classes they spoke of how to read stars, how to approach sacred mountains, how to greet a new dawn. They told children that courage was not just in battle, but in patience. The same lesson their ancestors had learned from the desert wind. Each retelling reaffirmed the rhythm of life that had survived migration, colonization, and exile. Politically, Apache nations grew increasingly assertive. The 1975 Indian Self-Determination Act gave tribes greater control over their own programs, and the Apache used it to reclaim governance of schools, health services, and land management. For the first time since the 1800s, decisions affecting their lives were made in Apache hands. Meetings were held not in English only, but bilingually, reflecting the unity of generations. The memory of forced silence in boarding schools now stood reversed. Speaking Apache was an act of sovereignty. The 1990s brought another layer of recognition. Archaeologists and historians began working directly with tribal councils, ensuring that ancestral sites and burial grounds were protected. The Apache became partners in museums, not subjects of them. Oral histories that had long circulated privately were recorded and archived under tribal control. Even the US military, once their greatest enemy, invited Apache elders to bless memorial sites in Arizona and New Mexico, acknowledging at last that the nation's expansion had come at a cost. Throughout this era, the Apache worldview, seeing land not as possession, but as relationship, quietly entered environmental thought. Tribal forest management practices were studied by conservationists. Their principle of taking only what the land could give became a model for sustainability. The same philosophy that had once kept them alive in the desert now offered wisdom to a world facing ecological crisis. Cultural pride deepened as language programs flourished. Radio stations broadcast in Apache. Bilingual dictionaries were printed. At Mescalero, recordings of ceremonial songs were digitized to preserve pronunciation for future generations. Children learned to greet the dawn with words their ancestors had spoken for 1,000 years. Each syllable felt like a homecoming. And yet memory remained complex. The wounds of displacement did not vanish with progress. Many elders who had lived through boarding schools or the final reservation relocations carried quiet sorrow. They spoke gently of what had been lost, sacred sites, left unvisited songs, forgotten between generations. But they also spoke of gratitude that the line of memory had not been broken. As the new millennium approached, the Apache stood, not as relics of the past, but as custodians of continuity. Their governments functioned, their languages revived, their ceremonies thrived. The wars were long over, but their lessons endured. Never forget where the water flows. Never break faith with the land, and never confuse silence with defeat. As the 21st century unfolded, the Apache story entered a new phase. One not of conquest or captivity, but of continuity. The landscape that had once been the battleground of empires now echoed with the sounds of schools' councils and community gatherings. Across Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, the 6 main Apache nations, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Fort Sill, San Carlos Tonto, and White Mountain, stood as sovereign entities. Each bore its own scars, its own triumphs, and its own way of honoring the past. What united them was not nostalgia, but responsibility. The quiet understanding that survival itself was now a form of victory. At Mescalero, elders began every meeting with a prayer to the 4 directions. Their words, once whispered in secret during the boarding school era, now opened public ceremonies. The language had been restored in classrooms where children recited numbers and greetings in Apache before switching to English lessons. Teachers who had once been punished for speaking their mother tongue now stood at chalkboards passing it forward. In every phrase echoed defiance and tenderness, the refusal to let silence become erasure. Technology, once a symbol of assimilation, became a tool of preservation. Linguists and tribal members collaborated to create digital dictionaries and phone apps, teaching Apache words, pronunciation, and stories. YouTube videos recorded traditional songs. Online archives stored oral histories, narrated by elders in their native voices. Young people, some living far from the reservations, could reconnect through screens, discovering heritage through pixels and memory. Modernity had become an ally rather than an enemy. Economically, the Apache nations found new paths to autonomy. Tourism, forestry, gaming enterprises, and renewable energy projects brought revenue that funded schools, clinics, and cultural programs. The Mescalero Apache built a sustainable forestry program and managed the Inn of the Mountain Gods resort, combining tradition with modern enterprise. The White Mountain Apache developed one of the most successful fish hatchery and wildlife conservation programs in the Southwest. The Jicarilla Apache leveraged oil and gas leases to provide scholarships for youth, ensuring that the next generation could study without abandoning their identity. But progress carried its own challenges. Globalization and modern culture crept into every reservation. Smartphones and streaming media reshaped daily life, sometimes distancing the young from the old. Elders warned that language and ceremony could fade again, not from prohibition this time, but from distraction. Yet where older generations saw danger, younger ones saw opportunity. Apache musicians blended traditional chants with guitar and electronic beats. Artists painted sacred mountains in neon hues. Activists used social media to raise awareness about land rights and water protection. The tools of the modern world, once used to erase them, now amplified their voices. Environmental stewardship remained at the heart of Apache philosophy. Across all bands, the idea that land was alive, an ancestor, not a possession-guided decision-making. When wildfires ravaged parts of Arizona and New Mexico, Apache firefighting crews became national leaders in forest management, combining ancestral knowledge with modern science. They read the wind soil and sloped the way their ancestors once read the desert sky. Federal agencies studying climate change began consulting Apache experts, recognizing that the wisdom of those who had lived in harmony with scarcity might be key to surviving the planet's future. Spiritually, renewal came with the same rhythm that had once guided migration. The sunrise dance continued as a 4-day ceremony, marking a young woman's transition into adulthood. The mountain spirit dancers, masked figures representing divine protectors, performed with renewed vigor. Their movements, slow and deliberate, told of balance between strength and humility. Each drumbeat was both echo and heartbeat, binding generations through time. The story of Geronimo, too, was retold through new eyes. No longer merely a warrior myth, he became a symbol of resistance to injustice and the cost of resilience. His descendants, now elders themselves, spoke at universities and cultural events, reminding audiences that his defiance was not about hatred, but about belonging. When a U.S. Army helicopter unit adopted his name as a symbol of courage, Apache leaders offered mixed reactions: pride that his spirit was remembered, sorrow that it was often misunderstood. To them, Geronimo was not a shout of bravado, but a prayer whispered to the land. Modern Apache governance evolved with quiet determination. Tribal courts adjudicated disputes in accordance with both U.S. law and Apache principles. Councils debated water rights, education, and environmental regulation with the same patience once used to plan raids or migrations. Leadership was no longer earned through war, but through service. Young council members, men and women alike, rose who carried laptops instead of rifles, yet spoke with the same measured cadence their ancestors had used around campfires. Education became a cornerstone of the 21st century Apache revival. Tribal colleges and scholarship programs encouraged students to study law, medicine, and environmental science while grounding their learning in culture. Many returned home after graduation, taking roles as teachers, park rangers, and administrators. For them, success was not assimilation, but contribution, the chance to use knowledge to heal both land and community. The Apache presence expanded far beyond the reservations. Musicians, writers, and filmmakers began telling stories from Apache perspectives, breaking stereotypes built by Hollywood centuries before. Books written by Apache authors explored history, identity, and spirituality with nuance and pride. In museums once filled with stolen artifacts, Apache curators began reclaiming narrative control. The voices that had been silenced for generations were now shaping how the world remembered. Even in the wider currents of native activism, the Apache remained central. They joined other tribes in defending sacred sites from mining and pipelines, arguing not only for environmental protection, but for spiritual survival. In 2015, when Apache stronghold activists marched to save Oak Flat, a sacred site in Arizona threatened by copper mining, they walked with banners quoting both scripture and oral tradition. Their message was the same one carried for centuries. The land is alive. You cannot own what you cannot understand. Through it all, humor persisted. Laughter, the oldest Apache medicine, filled homes and gatherings. It was the same quiet sarcasm that had once mocked the absurdities of conquest. They tried to bury us, one elder joked, but they forgot we know the earth better than anyone. It was resilience distilled into wit. As the century advanced, the Apache no longer stood in the shadow of their past, but alongside it. They had transformed tragedy into wisdom loss, into continuity. Every road, every school, every ceremony was an act of remembrance disguised as daily life. The warriors of the desert had not vanished. They had simply changed weapons from bows and rifles to pens, microphones, and community plans. By the 2020s, Apache life had come to embody the quiet paradox of modern indigenous survival, rooted in ancient soil, yet entwined with the global world. The reservations, once designed as cages, had become centers of renewal. The Mescalero and Jicarilla councils hosted international conferences on land management. The Fort Sill Apache tribe built museums preserving the memory of their imprisonment and resilience. The same lands where soldiers had once guarded them now echoed with laughter festivals and the low hum of economic independence. Freedom, after centuries of being fought for, was no longer a dream, it was a daily practice. Everyday life on the reservations reflected a delicate equilibrium between old and new. At dawn, elders still prayed to the four directions, sprinkling cornmeal as offering. By mid-morning, their grandchildren logged into online classes or commuted to college. Pickup trucks rolled past ceremonial grounds where ancient songs were rehearsed under amplifiers. The juxtaposition was seamless cell towers and sacred fires sharing the same horizon. The Apache had mastered not just endurance, but synthesis, turning the tools of a changing world into allies rather than threats. Cultural preservation was no longer about recovery, but revitalization. The Apache language, once whispered in defiance, was now taught through podcasts, YouTube tutorials, and bilingual storybooks for children. Tribal radio stations broadcast morning news in English, followed by bedtime stories in Apache. The internet, a global network, had become a digital campfire, a new way to pass wisdom across distance. Some elders, skeptical at first, grew to appreciate hearing their language travel farther than even the fastest rider of old. Artistic expression flourished as another form of reclamation. Apache painters and sculptors reimagined ancestral figures through modern media, metal glass, digital projection, each piece a conversation between survival and reinvention. Fashion designers incorporated traditional beadwork and geometric patterns into contemporary clothing, their collections shown in New York, Berlin, and Tokyo. Apache filmmakers told stories of the desert from within, replacing stereotypes with nuance. In these creative acts, the old phrase NDBRT, Apache voice, gained a new global resonance. Economically, progress came with careful stewardship. The tribes invested revenues from tourism and energy into healthcare, housing, and cultural education. The Mescaleros forestry program, blending traditional ecological knowledge with modern science, became a model of sustainable industry. The Jicarilla used oil revenues to fund scholarship endowments, ensuring that their children could study anywhere in the world without losing connection to home. On the White Mountain Reservation, rangers combined drone mapping with ancestral tracking skills to monitor wildlife and restore fire cycles. These were not gestures toward modernity. They were continuations of the old Apache art, reading the land and listening to its rhythm. Religion and spirituality intertwined in diverse ways. Christianity, long a presence since the missionary era, remained part of some families' faith, yet it had become indigenized mixed with Apache cosmology expressed in ceremonies that honored both saints and spirits of the mountains. The younger generations often saw no contradiction in this blend. As one Mescalero youth put it during a cultural panel, our ancestors learned to survive by making space for everything that didn't kill us. We still do. Amid progress, memory remains sacred. On anniversaries of Geronimo's surrender or Cochise's peace schools held commemorations not as mourning, but as reflection. Children recited stories of their ancestors, not as tragic relics, but as moral foundations, patience, dignity, endurance. The Apache calendar no longer revolved around war or exile. It revolved around gratitude. Each harvest festival, each community meal became a living acknowledgement of what survival had cost and what it had achieved. In the broader world, the Apache became ambassadors of indigenous resilience. Tribal leaders spoke at the United Nations on environmental ethics and sovereignty. Apache veterans, descendants of scouts and warriors alike, represented their nations at military memorials, wearing uniforms stitched with both U.S. flags and tribal emblems. Their presence embodied the reconciliation of two identities once thought irreconcilable. The irony of history was not lost on them. The same government that had once imprisoned their ancestors now invited them to speak of wisdom and healing. Young activists continued to defend sacred land. In Arizona, the battle over Oak Flat persisted, a fight not for profit, but for spiritual continuity. Apache youth stood alongside environmental allies, live streaming prayers and songs from the cliffs. Their voices, transmitted across continents, carried the same defiance that had echoed in the canyons of old. "We are not protecting the land," one young woman said during a rally. "We are part of it. If it falls, so do we." Those words, spoken with quiet conviction, echoed the philosophy that had guided her ancestors since the first migrations southward from the frozen forests of Alaska. Even in cities, the Apache presence expanded. Urban community centers offered language classes, cultural nights, and powwows, where Apache drummers performed alongside Lakota Navajo and Pueblo musicians. The once isolated desert culture had become part of a vast network of native solidarity stretching across the continent. These gatherings, filled with laughter and motion, were less about nostalgia than about collective future proof that the Apache spirit was not confined to geography, but carried wherever their people walked. Elders, those living libraries of memory, became revered again. Their counsel guided councils and inspired documentaries, their stories archived with respect. But perhaps their greatest gift was still intangible, the calm clarity they carried in every sentence. When asked how their people had survived so much, one elder replied, "We remembered who we were when everyone else forgot." That statement became a kind of modern creed, painted on murals, printed on t-shirts, repeated in classrooms and community halls. By the close of the decade, Apache sovereignty was not merely legal, it was lived. Their governments negotiated water rights, managed vast forests, and educated new generations. The wounds of the past had not vanished. They were visible in poverty, addiction, and loss, but they were met with the same resolve that had once faced armies. Healing had become their final war, and they were winning it with patience rather than bullets. The 21st century carried the Apache into an era where the stories of survival finally began to shape the world that once sought to erase them. Across the United States and beyond, scholars, educators, and environmentalists turned to Apache traditions not as relics, but as blueprints, ways to think about resilience, sustainability, and belonging. The same worldview that had once been dismissed as primitive was now studied as wisdom. For the Apache, this recognition was not triumphal. It was quiet satisfaction, a long-delayed acknowledgement that their ancestors' ways of seeing the earth had always been correct. At Mescalero, San Carlos, White Mountain, and Jicarilla, councils met regularly to discuss everything from climate policy to renewable energy. Elders sat beside university-trained environmental scientists, speaking of rainfall patterns, soil memory, and the behavior of animals. Their collaboration produced data that surprised even federal agencies. Apache ecological methods, burn cycles, grazing rotation, and sacred site preservation proved more sustainable than most modern models. The land responded in kind. Forests thickened, rivers ran cleaner, and wildlife returned. In this harmony between old and new knowledge, the Apache found a renewed sense of purpose. Cultural confidence deepened as language revitalization reached a new generation. Immersion programs taught Apache to toddlers. Mobile apps and augmented reality tools let users explore sacred geography through interactive maps. Grandmothers could teach proverbs through video calls to grandchildren living in distant cities. The language once silenced in boarding schools now flowed through microphones and screens, carried not as nostalgia, but as lifeblood. The word Endi, meaning the people regained its full meaning in modern form. Art continued to flourish as a bridge between eras. Painters blended sacred symbolism with social commentary. Writers explored the tension between historical trauma and present identity, while filmmakers captured the quiet dignity of reservation life without exoticism or pity. At cultural festivals, young dancers performed to electronic remixes of ancient drum rhythms, merging time layers into a single heartbeat. Audiences from around the world watched online mesmerized not by spectacle, but by sincerity. The Apache voice had found its global echo, but its cadence remained grounded in the soft breath of desert wind. Economically, the Apache nations grew more independent each decade. Casinos and resorts provided income, but were managed with caution, their profits reinvested in education, housing, and healthcare. Renewable energy projects, solar farms in New Mexico, wind installations in Arizona emerged under tribal ownership. The irony of harnessing the sun and wind was not lost on the people who had once prayed to them as living beings. Now technology served the same purpose as ceremony balance between need and respect. Modern governance demanded new kinds of warriors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, historians, each defending the tribe in their own way. The descendants of Geronimo and Cochise worked in courts and universities, arguing not with rifles but with research. Treaties once ignored became legal battlegrounds for water and land rights. When Apache lawyers stood before federal judges to defend sacred sites, they invoked not only legal precedent, but ancestral memory. Our law, one advocate said, was written by the mountains before yours ever reached paper. It was a statement not of defiance, but of fact. Spiritual life adapted too. The sacred dances and healing ceremonies continued, but new rituals emerged alongside them. Blessings were offered at the openings of schools, hospitals, and solar plants, symbols that the Apache spirit belonged everywhere their people built something worth keeping. Christianity and traditional belief, once at odds, coexisted peacefully. Many Apache pastors delivered sermons that wove together Bible verses and oral tradition, reminding congregations that faith, too, could evolve without erasure. The sense of shared history between the Apache and their former adversaries had also shifted. Descendants of soldiers, settlers, and missionaries now visited reservations not as conquerors, but as students. Joint memorials were established at Fort Bowie and Fort Sill, where both sides' stories were told side by side. Apache veterans in modern uniforms stood beside historians, their speeches quiet and steady. There was no celebration of victory, only acknowledgement of endurance. For the Apache youth identity had become both inheritance and choice. They moved fluidly between worlds, attending universities, building careers, and then returning home to teach or govern. Some pursued arts and activism. Others entered politics, bringing indigenous perspectives into state and national policy. They did not speak of reclaiming the past, they spoke of carrying it forward. "We're not going back to live as our ancestors did," one young leader said at a conference, "but we're going forward, carrying what they knew." The emotional landscape of the people softened with time. Anger at past injustices gave way to reflection, and reflection became pride. Every name, Geronimo, Victorio, Mangascochis, shifted from legend to lineage, from burden to blessing. Elders encouraged laughter, again reminding their communities that humor had always been the strongest defense. Jokes about history carried the sting of truth, but also its healing power. "The Americans taught us paperwork," one elder said with a smile, "so we used it to get our land back." Through these transformations, one truth endured. The Apache never forgot their relationship with the land. In a century obsessed with speed and extraction, their insistence on patience and reciprocity stood as quiet rebellion. Children still learned the constellations, hunters still gave thanks to their prey, and storytellers still began with the same phrase, "long ago, when the world was new." The repetition itself was survival. Visitors who travel through Apache country today often remark on the stillness. It is not emptiness they feel, but presence, the awareness that beneath every hill lies history, and above every firelight hums continuity. The people who once vanished into the mountains at the approach of soldiers now walk openly through their lands, carrying both sorrow and serenity in equal measure. And in the evenings, when music drifts across Mescalero Lake or prayers rise over the Jicarilla forests, the air feels suspended between centuries. The same wind that once bore the sounds of hoofbeats now carries laughter, the same laughter that has defied every empire that tried to silence it. The Apache have not merely survived, they have transcended survival. They are no longer a story told about resistance. They are the living proof that endurance, when paired with grace, becomes permanence.